Hey guys, it's Mary and welcome back to Study Journey. Welcome back to the Python series. This is the third episode of the News Monitor game, and we're just going to be writing the code and continuing our game from the previous episodes. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, so in the previous episode, we have just defined phrase trigger, and this is an abstract class of trigger. But now we have two subclasses for phrase trigger, which is title trigger and description trigger. So as we can see the diagram above, trigger is a big class, and within it we have a lot of subclasses. And inside phrase trigger, there's also two subclasses, which are title trigger and description trigger. So let's write the code for these. So problem 3 is title trigger. It says to implement a phrase trigger subclass title trigger that fires when a news item's title contains a given phrase. So for example, an instance of this type of trigger could be used to generate an alert whenever the phrase Intel processors occurred in the title of a news item. As it was in phrase trigger, the phrase should be an argument to the class's constructor and the trigger should not be case sensitive. So it says for us to think carefully about what methods should be defined in title trigger and what methods should be inherited from the superclass. And once you've implemented title trigger, the title trigger unit test for this you should pass. And remember that we already have evaluate in trigger, so we don't have to worry about that. And if you're not passing the unit test, which is in the test file, then it tells us that fail means our code runs but produces the wrong answer, and error means that the code crashes due to some error. So now let's define this. Well, as we know, we're going to define the class title trigger, and it is a subclass of phrase trigger. So it's going to inherit properties from phrase trigger. And it tells us that as it was in phrase trigger, the phrase should be an argument to the class's constructor and the trigger should not be case sensitive. So we can just inherit what we had in phrase trigger right here. So when we define init, it's still going to take in self and then phrase, and we can just do super, because it's a super class init. And then it's going to take in phrase. Okay, and then it says that we have to remember all subclasses that inherit from the trigger interface should include a working evaluate method. So when we're evaluating it in title trigger, let's define evaluate. And we're obviously going to do self and then the story, because that's what we're going to be evaluating here. And within this, first it is going to be it's not going to be case sensitive, so I'm going to make the title story.getTitle, because we have to retrieve the title first, and then we're going to make it dot lower. And before we can get it to work, obviously we knew from before that some phrases are not considered phrases. For example, if there are letters in between them, or for example, this one's pretty tricky because it has purple cow next to each other, but it has an S with the cow. So cows and cow are not the same thing in the scenario. So we have to get rid of all of these, we have to get rid of the punctuation and the extra spaces to see if it is actually a phrase or not. So we're going to do something called translation table. So I'm going to define translation table, and it's just going to be string.makeTrans, which means the make the translation table. And so for the string punctuation, as we can see, you might want to use it here. We're actually going to, first, there's going to be a space. And for every space, we're going to do that for every punctuation. We're going to turn it into a space. So length of whatever, how long the punctuation is, we're going to make it a space instead. And because of this, now our title is only going to contain letters and spaces and no punctuation. So it gets rid of all the punctuation marks. And then we can use the title and run it through the translation table. And now that we have this, we can do resub, and then it's going to be R, okay, and then S plus space and then the title. Okay, so now that we have this, we can actually see if the phrase is next to each other. So even if you have purple and even if you have cow, we have to make sure that, for example, we have to make sure that, for example, there's not going to be an S after it. So how can we write code for this? So first, if the phrase is in the title, because this is a title trigger, so we have to make sure it is in the title before we do it. Let's set the position to be the title index, so the index of the phrase, first that, and then let's add it to the length of the phrase. So what this means is if the length of the title is greater than the position, and then the title, the letter with the position in the title is greater than or equal to A and it's less than Z. What this means is if it is a letter. Then we're going to return false, because this means that there is a letter right after the phrase. So basically right here, this is the phrase and this is the index. So for example, if it was purple cow, we would add that and then we would end up right here. So this index, this is saying if the length of the title is greater than that position, so this length is greater than this, and then this position right here is a letter, then it's going to be obviously next to the phrase, and it's going to make it not the phrase because we have something in addition to it. And then we're going to return false. Otherwise, we can return true. And obviously, this is if the phrase is in the title. If the phrase is not in the title, then we can just return false. And with that, we have just defined the title trigger, which is a subclass of phrase trigger. This was pretty difficult to understand, but we're going to do something very similar in the next episode with description trigger.